Third on our list, Shedeur Sanders. Maybe the biggest surprise is that he's not number 2 on the list, but I think that he and Jackson Dart are pretty close together in fantasy terms. Sanders is number 2 in our QB model scores at the moment, would sit 12th among all QB prospects since 2021, just ahead of Michael Penix Jr. and JJ McCarthy. Every other member of this class, including Jackson Dart, currently carries a model score lower than Will Levis's from 2 years ago. Shane, I know you have some concerns about Shedeur Sanders, both from an NFL standpoint and as a fantasy asset going forward.
I think from a fantasy perspective, we look for that rushing. And I think Shedeur Sanders is not bereft of rushing talent. He's athletic enough. You can see the mobility in the pocket, but if he gets drafted and starts, he'll be one of 2 starting NFL quarterbacks with negative career rushing yards in college football. Him and Jared Goff is the other. Now, the reason for that for Shedeur Sanders, he was the most sacked quarterback in 2024 in FBS and the most sacked quarterback in 2023 in FBS. Part of that on the poor offensive line in Colorado, that part of that on Shedeur Sanders himself. So I don't think you're going to get scripted runs from him. I don't think we're going to get much rushing from him, but could pick up a scramble here and there. So for fantasy, it means he's got to be a really good passer. And I'm just not convinced that Shedeur Sanders is a really good passer. He has the accuracy, he has ball placement. I think a lot of the things he does between the ears when he's looking downfield in terms of reading progressions and manipulating the safety with his eyes, he can do some advanced things when he's reading before he throws the football. But we saw at the Colorado offense, a lot of passes behind the offensive line, very short. He liked to keep that completion percentage very high. And so when things were covered, you can see Shedeur Sanders gets worried. He starts to drift back in the pocket, holds the ball way too long, and he drifts so far back that the edge rushers just makes it so easy for them to come across the edge. I think that's why he got sacked so much. His arm strength is, I'd say, mediocre. I worry about kind of cover 2 defenses, those 2 deep safety looks that we know defenses like so much in the current NFL. It's going to be really hard to have cover 2 busters with him along the sidelines. So I feel like the fantasy upside is just capped, even if he has a good or great year, kind of like we saw with CJ Stroud as a rookie. It's like that might be the upside of Shedeur Sanders. The downside is if you're not an elite passer having a great season, is he really going to be someone for your fantasy team that can make a difference?
And so the question then, maybe the bigger question, is the rushing, at least for fantasy purposes. And, I don't watch much college football at this point because most of my fall is, eaten up by pro football. So I kind of catch up on the college guys at the end of the year. I did see a couple of Colorado games along the way. So then when we're past the season and getting into this stuff to get ready for these shows and our rookie rankings and all that, Jared, I was surprised to see how little rushing yardage there was to Shedeur Sanders. And honestly, I was worried that I was being kind of racist about it. Like, oh, here's a black quarterback. I thought he ran more than that. But you mentioned taking the sack yardage out, adding it back in as we, review these guys and figure out what we can expect from them going forward. And when you do factor that in, because NCAA stats take away sack yards from quarterback rushing yardage, NFL numbers don't. So we should factor that yardage into the totals here in figuring out what to expect. And when you do that, there's a lot more yardage to Shedeur Sanders. He ran for 17 touchdowns in his college career. So clearly he's not running backwards and scoring touchdowns. I mean, that's a safety if you run backwards into the end zone. So he was clearly running forward at times. He has an issue taking sacks, but he can run more than what his numbers say, and maybe a lot more than what his numbers say.
I was surprised digging into the numbers earlier this week, just in preparation for the show. If you omit sacks, which is a major problem for Sanders, maybe his biggest problem is all the sacks he took. But if you omit the sacks, he actually averaged 23.5 rushing yards per game last year, 28.5 rushing yards per game over his 2 seasons at Colorado, which is actually more than Cam Ward averaged across his 3 seasons in the FBS. So I'm still with Shane here that I don't think Sanders is going to get to the NFL and we're going to say, this is a guy that's going to score fantasy points for us with his legs. Like, that's not going to be what he does. I don't think he's Jared Goff as a runner. I think he's going to give us a bit more rushing production than that. Somewhere in between a Jared Goff and a David Garrard, I guess, is where I'd put Shedeur Sanders as a rusher. So I have concerns about him as a passer too, though. Like as Shane also said, the 74% completion rate looks nice at first glance, but he came on an 8.1 average target depth. And again, we had Jackson Dart above 11. Cam Ward was at 9.8. A lot more shorter passes for Shedeur Sanders. Actually, only 24% of his completions the last 2 seasons were on throws over 10 yards down the field. So if my math's right, that's 76% of his completions were on throws, within 10 yards of the line of scrimmage. Now, he's super accurate on that stuff. So that's good. But just, does he have the arm to give us fantasy upside on, some of those bigger plays down the field? I'm not sure about that. And then the sacks are definitely an issue as well. He did play behind a really bad offensive line at Colorado. Last year, Sanders was pressured on 36% of his dropbacks. That was 38th highest in the FBS. But he had a 20.1% pressure to sack rate. So 20% of the times he was pressured, it turned into a sack. That ranked 89th among 128 qualifying quarterbacks. So, he was to blame as well for a lot of those sacks. So he's going to have to clean up that. And I think the combination of like the poor pocket presence or whatever it is that's causing these sacks and the subpar arm strength, that's kind of a scary combination.
Not an exciting prospect right now. It does sit number 3 on our list, but I think I'm probably going to pretty easily take Jackson Dart ahead of him. We're going to see where he goes draft wise, because right now is the time where all the rumors start flying, and there are some who are like, oh, he's still in play at 3, that's why the Giants are checking him out, and there are others who are like, he's not going to go in the top 10. He might not even go in round 1. So it's going to be very interesting to see where Shedeur Sanders lands. And that's ultimately going to have, a good bit of impact in his fantasy outlook. Shane gave Shedeur Sanders the full dynasty value treatment on draftsharks.com. So you can check that out for video clips that show off the red flags that we've been talking about here and talk about the limitations on his fantasy upside going forward.